Welcome, Kerbal enthusiasts. Matthew Carr here, and today I'll be wrangling an asteroid, a fairly large one at that. Now, this was my first experience with the 23.5 patch, and you can tell somewhat because I'm trying to launch this rocket and it has nowhere near the thrust-to-weight ratio that is ideal. You can even see me firing up the nukes early to try and even that out a little bit. But it still gets into orbit, and so it's good enough for my purposes. Not so wisely, I hadn't actually picked out an asteroid as a target for this mission until I already launched, whereabout I went and found a D-class asteroid that passed around the moon's distance from Kerbin. You can see its path in the background there. Owing to this lack of foresight, I have to do a plane change maneuver, and so you see me burning here to raise my apoapsis. That's the first key to doing a plane change. You don't want to plane change close to Kerbin, you want to plane change as far as possible. Now I get lucky here and get an intercept with the moon. And that turns out to be very useful for doing both my plane change and getting out to a good distance. So I subtly tweak my orbit to go over the moon as opposed to in front of it or behind it, and this will force me to go down as I leave the moon, giving me an inclined plane. This gets me much closer to the asteroid's orbit, and my eventual goal is to get as close to the asteroid's orbit as possible while still maintaining an orbit that does not leave Kerbin's sphere of influence. The next step is to fully align my orbital plane with the asteroid's orbital plane. I'm going to do this at the descending node because it's further from Kerbin, and the further you are out, the less delta V it requires to do a plane change maneuver. For certain maneuvers, I like to just set up the node and use that as a direction indicator. Once I'm facing that direction, I delete the node and do the burn manually. This allows me to watch the map as I do the burn and gives me a degree of fine control that I find hard to achieve with the maneuver nodes. Now that the planes are aligned, it's time to shape the orbit to be a similar shape to that of the asteroid. I start out by burning at apoapsis to lower the inside of the orbit. I go in slightly more than I would have liked originally because the moon gets in the way and I don't want to intersect its orbit and get thrown off course. I then fast forward to periapsis and burn retrograde until my orbit is tangent with the orbit of the asteroid. The problem here is that the orbit intersects after the asteroid has passed its own periapsis with Kerbin, which would mean I'd be slowing it down in suboptimal time. So I blow up my orbit a little more, and then I'm just working to kind of shift it around in a circle. I do this in a few stages. First I expand the orbit, and then I go to the point where the orbits intersect. From here I burn primarily toward Kerbin. This has the effect of rotating the orbit, essentially moving periapsis to where I am. The orbit is also expanding, and this is because I'm burning prograde in addition to toward Kerbin, so I switched to burning retrograde, and this allows the orbit to shrink a bit. This ends with a solid orbit, approximately tangent to the asteroid's orbit right at periaps, which is what I'm looking for. Now we need to adjust for timing. It wouldn't do to be on the opposite side of the orbit when the asteroid comes in. We need to align. The way I do this is I put a maneuver node right where I am, or slightly ahead of where I am, and just expand it out slightly so you can just tell the line's different. Then I put a maneuver node on this far side. You can then adjust the node forward or back any number of orbits by using the little blue buttons beneath. Once I dial in the number of orbits required to get the intercepts to be in the system, I go back to the first node and adjust forward and back until I can get the intercepts to align almost perfectly. Once they do, it's just as simple as going forward and executing that node, and I'll be close to getting an intercept. At this point I clear the remaining maneuver nodes and just fast forward time until I actually have the intercept coming up on the next orbit. The asteroid won't be in Kerbin's system yet, but it'll be close. At this point I'm just trying to get the intercepts to align as closely as possible without putting too much effort in, as things will probably shift once the asteroid enters Kerbin's sphere of influence. I don't bother with maneuver nodes, I just kind of wing it, burning prograde and retrograde until they line up. Then it's just some more fast forwarding until the asteroid actually enters Kerbin's sphere of influence. You can see the jump here when it does. Now it's all about trying to make the intercepts line perfectly. So it's going to be an iterative process of moving in and then making fine adjustments, and then moving in a bit closer and making more fine adjustments. At this point I'm using RCS to do my fine adjustments, and not really bothering maneuver nodes. I just kind of squirt around with RCS until I get as close as possible. I try pushing one way and then the other and see which brings me closer, watching the indicator like a hawk. I try to get the intercept distance to be 0, but as you can see it's bouncing around quite a bit, so I'm never going to get it perfect. I'm just going to get it close. Then I fast forward and do my fine adjustments. At this point I pretty much stop using the map and use the nav ball instead. I put it in target mode so I can see the velocity relative to me, and then I can just burn counter to that to reduce the relative velocity between us. When doing this, I have a bit of a trick. If you can get the green and pink indicators to align with each other, then you're perfectly on target. Somewhere around this point I realized I needed to rebalance my fuel, and so I went about doing that. I may have chosen a very poor time to do so. At least I was really on target. A quick load later, you can see more of my technique to get the away from target and retrograde markers to align. When doing this, I look at the away from target marker as the center, and then look at my retrograde markers being outside of it. Then I point my ship slightly further outside of that. When I burn, this will push the two markers further together, and when the markers are overlapping perfectly, that means you're dead on toward your target. Now it's simply a matter of just killing the rest of my velocity, leaving me going toward the asteroid at only a few meters per second. I then can break out the grabber, the new part introduced in 23.5 to grab the asteroids, and you can see me opening it up here after I fumble around for the lights, and that will allow me to grab onto the asteroid. So I turn around and have that facing the asteroid, and you can see my lovely colored purple lights lighting up the asteroid, and I slowly approach in, and then you just wait. I use the RCS to adjust slightly. I'm avoiding having a really rough collision, although I'm pretty sure that grabber can actually take a stronger collision than I have. And there we have it. The asteroid is joined to my ship. Now all I need to do is get it home. Well, priorities. I also need to give it a name, which naming it a moon may be a bit forward of me. Now, rendezvousing with the asteroid may be the part I've seen people complaining the most about and having the most trouble with, but actually getting it home, for me at least, was very difficult. As I said at the start, this is the first asteroid I've interacted with, and so I didn't exactly know what I was getting into, nor did I know if I had enough fuel to do it at all. The hardest part, you see, is keeping the ship stable. The gripper is not all that strong a connection, and it flexes a lot, as you can see here as I try to turn the asteroid around. I have a fair amount of the reaction wheels on this ship, and there's still not enough to turn this thing quickly at all. And I use the feature of the gripper that you can release the pivot to pivot around and try to get it aligned with the center of mass, and then spin up. But if your alignment's even slightly out of whack, the whole thing starts tipping off to the side, as you can see. A lot of me getting it home was struggling with this fact and trying to find ways to counteract it. Now, this is nowhere near as much trouble on smaller asteroids, as the mass of the ship relative to the mass of the asteroid tends to be much larger, and the strength of the claw isn't as much of a problem. Now, if you're planning a mission from scratch for a larger asteroid, I highly would recommend setting up in a puller configuration rather than a pushing configuration, as that's naturally stable, while this is naturally unstable. I eventually started using a solution you see here, where I actually kept the pivot unlocked, and then kind of chased it around, and I found as long as I stayed outside the pivot, my engine would actually be pushing things back inward. It was neither an easy nor stable technique, but it did eventually allow me to get things done. You can see here as I finally pushed the asteroid into a stable orbit, and there we have curb and capture. The asteroid is now technically a moon. Now that the asteroid's in a stable orbit, I'm no longer any real time pressure, so it's time to get out and do some science to this asteroid in high Kerbin orbit. Now, asteroids you could take samples of with a Kerbal. As far as I know, that's the only science you can do them right now, but each asteroid has its own separate science, so you can collect unlimited science if you keep capturing asteroids. With that delicious science tucked away, it's time to get this into an orbit closer to Kerbin. As with any other ship, to lower the orbit, you just go to apoapsis and burn retrograde, and you see me doing that here. In my case, as I was burning in, I get lucky and get an intercept with the moon to provide a gravity assist, so I decide to use it. At this distance out, adjusting for a proper gravity assist can be a little tricky, as changing the orbit is very sensitive. You can see it wildly swing around here, and that's just from me turning the ship. I'm not even applying any thrust. I abuse time warp a little bit here to lock in the exact orbit that I want, and when I get a good one locked in, I just up the time warp and let it execute. and I just get to see my asteroid do a quick flyby the moon. If I was smart, I could have collected some more science here in both high and low lunar orbit. I was not clever and didn't think of it until just now. Coming out of the moon sphere of influence, I end up with an orbit that goes in quite close to Kerbin, but not close enough. And so I have to burn retrograde some more, using up some more of the last of my precious fuel. You can see the gauge is getting really close to empty there. But luck is with me, and I do have enough to lower my periapsis down into the atmosphere of Kerbin. I go for around 45 kilometers up, because I'm going for some aerobraking here. And I just fast forward and bring the asteroid into Kerbin's atmosphere. This burns off a lot of my speed. It's pretty much a standard aerobraking maneuver, I'm just doing it with a 600-ton asteroid attached to me. Now, I wasn't particularly planning this out, nor do I have any plans for the asteroid, so I just aerobraked until I felt I had a good height. I end up with an apoapsis of 1,200 kilometers, which I feel is adequate for doing some monitoring, maybe building a space station. Haven't really decided what to do with it yet. The last thing I need to do is stabilize the orbit, since the periapsis is currently in Kerbin's atmosphere, which would not work for long-term storage. So I get to apoapsis and start burning, and it works pretty well until I run out of fuel. Then I just start using the RCS fuel I have remaining to just finish off circularizing the orbit. It ends up with a periapsis of about 75 kilometers, which is just outside of Kerbin's atmosphere. In classic Kerbal fashion, I'll call that good enough. I got the asteroid into what's relatively low orbit and easily reachable from Kerbin's surface. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you either learned something or were amused, or hopefully both. If you want, there's a craft file in the description below. This has been Matthew Carr, signing out.